Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. My name is Michelle Weiss-Little, sister of fallen hero, FDNY, firefighter David Martin Weiss. Rescue 1, Midtown Manhattan. Murdered on September 11th, 2001. His body never recovered. North Tower, the first tower hit, the second to fall. How painful it must have been for his fellow brothers who searched for days on end for lost souls whose dust would cover our rescuers. Clothing, boots, skin, lungs, instead of living bodies. The nightmares, the agony. As a family member who has spoken up over these past 9 years, I am hopeful still that we, humanity, can come together, understand the depths of our connection, and wake up to the promise within each of us that there is love. And with love, we can push back the evil that men do with the power of love, the power of the heart. Our survival hinges on our willingness to face the truth, to find our own courage, to open our hearts, to hold accountable, to be responsible, to forgive, and to love. David was a firefighter, and firefighters risk their lives every day for their brothers and sisters, for you and for any of your family members. My brother would have gone into that building no matter who was in there, no matter who is responsible. He faced his fear, and he did his duty. As a country, we promised we would never forget. They gave their life. At the very least, we can give our time and attention to demand a real investigation. We are all connected in this life through a web. If we're all connected, then we can say that we're brothers and sisters. If we say that we're brothers and sisters, then I am your sister and David is your brother. As a family member, I have questions. Do you? As family members, we deserve truthful answers. That's why we're all here tonight. Like I tell my daughters every day, this is the only moment we have. Make it the most precious moment we've got.
It's my great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speakers. These professionals have been willing to place their credibility and reputations on the line, and they've endured substantial personal sacrifice. They're tireless and tenacious advocates for questions that all too few are willing to ask, and truths that fewer still are willing to face, truths that may shake the foundations of our worldview. Let me introduce you to a venturesome architect of over 20 years here in the San Francisco Bay Area and a member of the prestigious American Institute of Architects. He's been employed with local San Francisco Bay Area architecture firms and is now devoting 100% of his time and energy to this cause. Like many other architects, he's designed many fireproofed steel frame buildings in his career. Most recently, he co-managed the construction documents work on a $400 million mixed-use project in Nevada with almost 2 million square feet of retail parking structure and fireproofed steel-framed mid-rise office space with over 1,200 tons of steel framing altogether. His deep concern about the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center high-rises on 9/11 began after his exposure to David Ray Griffin on KPFA's Guns and Butter program hosted by Bonnie Faulkner. This changed Mr. Gage's life radically and launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11 inspiring him to found the organization Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. AE 9/11 Truth now numbers over 1,000 architects and engineers and 8,000 others, all demanding a new investigation into these catastrophic structural failures. Richard Gage has presented to over 150 packed audiences, and their worldviews have been irrevocably altered by this myth-shattering information. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Richard Gage, AIA. Richard?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's now an equal honor to introduce our featured speaker, a full-time 14-year firefighter who's assigned to Ladder 3 in the city of Seattle. Before becoming a firefighter, he was a paramedic in the Sacramento area for 8 years, leaving the Sacramento Fire Department for Seattle in '96. Altogether, over 22 years of experience in emergency services. He graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics from the University of California at Davis. In 2008, startled yet inspired by the factual and irrefutable presentation of the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, he decided that someone must step forward and take the heat for the truth. His 343 fallen brothers deserved no less. He felt that he had no choice in the matter. Like Richard Gage before him, it came forth as if a haunted, persistent calling. And so he founded the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, today numbering over 100 firefighters, all demanding a new investigation of the destruction of these 3 high-rises and an investigation of the investigators themselves.
Not all firefighters agree with our position, nor is Firefighters for 9/11 Truth endorsed by the Seattle Fire Department or any other city or agency employing the firefighters who have signed our petition. These are our individual beliefs.
Please welcome the courageous Erik Lawyer, Firefighters for 9/11 Truth.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we really appreciate the courage you have to show up and the openness you have to listen to what we have to say tonight. And I'm just going to start by telling a little bit about my story and how I came to change my views on this completely. Right after 9/11, I tried everything I could to get out to Ground Zero. I was on a team that we thought they were going to call up, but they didn't, and they ended up calling up a USAR team instead. Anyways, I went out there for the funerals. I helped support however I could. This was there about a month and a half after Ground Zero. And so I was very emotionally attached to it. When anyone would talk about it, I couldn't listen. I just didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to consider it. And my lieutenant for years had told me that it looked like, something didn't add up. And I just told him he was crazy. He should leave the country. I'm very patriotic, and I just thought, if you believe that anyone could be responsible for this, you shouldn't be here. It was a friend of mine from the military that actually opened my eyes to something else. And one thing led to another, and I kept looking. 9/11 kept coming up. And because it wasn't being shoved down my throat, I decided to look into it a little bit more. And when I did, I knew there was a lot of conspiracy theories out there and a lot of crazy conspiracy theories. And I decided to do my own research. And so I went to the Zacharias Moussaoui exhibit trials. This is the U.S. government's evidence on 9/11, basically. And I wanted to see what they had. I was kind of shocked. I wanted to know, how did they identify the terrorists so quickly? How were they so sure? And so as I started looking, this is what I found, and this is the main evidence that they had. This was found after the plane crash. This was found the next day. So you can see they found bandanas, papers, more passports. You can see these passports. They're pretty well intact. I've been to a lot of fires, and if they're out in a room that's not on fire, we'll find this kind of stuff. But the thing that stuck out to me, and someone else had pointed out, was, well, wait a second. Those passports, those IDs, they were inside either pockets or luggage or inside that plane. Then that plane hit those towers or went into the field or went into the Pentagon, and then they blew up. There were big fireballs we all saw, and then they were found actually on top of the pile. So that stuff started not adding up for me. I was like, well, wait a second. How'd they find it the next day? It should have been either on the ground or burned up or buried in the rubble. That led to Colonel Nelson Once I started looking into this, I read his article, and he's a 34-year Air Force crash investigator, and he'd written a pretty amazing article, and he talks about his own experience into 9/11. And once I spoke with him, I asked him, I said, when did you first notice something was wrong? He said, for me, it was the first day. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what stuck out to you? He said, well, I've been to a lot of crash sites. I know how they work. And he said, it was the Pentagon. And he said, when I looked at the Pentagon, and here's some pictures of it, he said, what I saw the first day was people picking up debris, and they were removing it as quickly as possible. He said, every crash I've ever been to, it's the MP's job to secure that area, flag it, tag it, take pictures. Nobody touches anything until after the investigators are there. Well, they were cleaning it up before any investigation. He said by day 3, he knew something was wrong. And by day 3 is when he said they identified the terrorists, and it was the IDs. He said, there's no way. He said, find those 19 terrorists. It would have taken weeks to months to find that kind of evidence, to sort through it, to go through it. And he said, they recreated the aircraft crash. He said it was impossible. So that really made me start thinking more. And the more I looked into it, the 9/11 Commission themselves, I found out, they doubt their own investigation. And so many people in America believe the 9/11 Commission. That's the people who believe the official story, they still swear by it. Well, I found out the investigators themselves don't. And so you're going to see here.
So there are all kinds of reasons. We thought we were set up to fail. We got started late. We had a very short time frame. Indeed, we had to get it extended. We did not have enough money. They were afraid we were going to hang somebody, that we would point the finger.
Lee and I write in our book that we think the commission in many ways was set up to fail because we had not enough money, we didn't have enough time, we'd been appointed by the most partisan people in Washington.
So then you go to their own website. They talk here about how much they spent, the 9/11 Commission budget. It started out at $3 million. Congress then gave them an additional $11 million, and the total commission was $15 million. Now, to put that in perspective, you can see that the Columbia Space Shuttle investigation was $175 million. The Challenger investigation was $100. Monica Lewinsky was $30. 9/11 was the greatest crime in U.S. history, and we had the least amount of money going into this investigation, and we still believe that investigation. Then I went to the FBI, and I said, well, they're the lead investigators. What do they say about it? Found out he is on the most wanted list, but what's shocking is he's not on the most wanted list for 9/11. They've been asked about that, and they've said that they don't have enough evidence to accuse him. So this is on the FBI's most wanted list. Murder of U.S. nationals outside the United States, conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, attack on a federal facility resulting in death. He's also wanted connection with the August 7th, 98 bombings of United States embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya. They never mention 9/11. They never mention the United States. The FBI doesn't have enough evidence. The 9/11 Commission doesn't believe in their own investigation. We should be looking at this, and we should be holding them accountable. And the 9/11 Commission themselves, some of the commissioners have said, it's a national scandal, and we need a real investigation. Thank you. The NFPA, this is what I first looked into when I started investigating it. And the NFPA is it's the National Fire Protection Association, and they set the standards for the fire service. They're not laws, they're not mandates that we have to follow, but they're guidelines. And as an example, it's staffing. If you don't follow certain rules going into a fire, you better have a good reason why the city's not doing it, because if someone gets hurt, they're going to get sued because they're not following the national standards. So the same thing happens with fire and explosion investigations. And this is the NFPA 921. This was approved as the national standard on February 9th, 2001. Now, there's no manual for when a plane flies into a building. They don't have to follow this exactly. What it was created for was for smaller cities that don't have their own investigation units. In this way, they could come in and they could see what are the basics that we should follow. And I've talked to some senior investigators in our department and actually across the country, and they've said they don't have to follow these exactly, but what they typically do is they go way beyond these. So we're going to be looking at the absolute basics. This is like 101. And so once you see what the basics call for, you're going to be surprised.
Myth. Normal evidence procedures were followed.
All right, well, we go back to the manual. 9.3.6.1, spoliation of evidence. Spoliation of evidence refers to the loss, destruction, or material alteration of an object or a document that is evidence or potential evidence in a legal proceeding by anyone who has responsibility for its preservation. It may occur when the movement, change, or destruction of evidence or the alteration of the scene significantly impairs the opportunity of other interested parties to obtain the same evidentiary value from the evidence as did prior investigators. Maintenance of evidence. After 9/11, there was a rescue and recovery operation going on. Whenever human life's there, we can break all the rules. We still do destroy the building before the investigators get there in what's called overhaul. And what that means is we have to search the ceilings and walls, we have to pull them apart to make sure there's no fire in those. And so we are destroying the point of origin a lot of times by doing that. But again, it's to stop the fire from burning more and to help rescue people. So it's normal for them to damage the evidence getting it out there. Now what they wouldn't do is eliminate it. So any destructive testing or destructive examination of the evidence may be necessary should occur only all reasonably known parties have been notified in advance and given the opportunity to participate in or observe the testing. So obviously NIST had an interest. They were an interested party since they were the lead investigators on the building collapse. So the evidence should have been preserved. And what we find out, and NIST themselves admits they had no physical evidence to do the investigation on World Trade Center 7. There's one fire chief in particular from New York. I've talked to him about it. He's actually written a book about this. And he said, I've heard this excuse a lot of times, and a lot of guys will just say, they'll shake their head and they'll just say, well, it's incompetence. You know, it was so much confusion. We didn't know what was going on. Well, we're talking about this was days after they started removing it, but this went on for months. You can't just make a 47-story building disappear. We protect the point of origin in a house fire. We remove the debris. We put it in a pile sometimes so the investigator can go through it. We tell the investigator where it is. We don't lose it like that. 47-story building is a lot harder to lose. I mean, sometimes we do on a house fire, we'll cover things up and not remember where we put it, but a 47-story building, it can't happen. So Bill Manning was one of the editors for Fire Engineering magazine. This is one of our more technical trade magazines in the fire service. We have Firehouse and Fire Engineering are two big ones. And I remember reading this article back right after 9/11, and I just thought it was kind of crazy, but I just excused it, thinking, well, it's about money, you know, and that's what I've heard a lot from other firefighters, is it's about money. They had money to make on the steel, and they, you know, in the recycling and all that, so it was like mob contracts where they did that type of thing. Well, Bill Manning didn't agree with that, and so what he has said, and this is from one of his articles called Selling Out the Investigation. He said, Fire Engineering has good reason to believe that the official investigation blessed by FEMA and run by the American Society of Civil Engineers is a half-baked farce that may have already been commandeered by political forces whose primary interests, to put mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. And this is a good point. I think all firefighters can connect with this. Did they throw away the locked doors from the Triangle Shirtwaist fire? Did they throw away the gas cans used at the Happy Land Social Club fire? Did they cast aside the pressure regulating valves at the Meridian Plaza fire? Of course not. But essentially, that's what they're doing at the World Trade Center. To treat the September 11th incident any differently would be the height of stupidity and ignorance. This is still Bill Manning. And this was a call to action. And unfortunately, I didn't listen to it back then, and I'm listening to it now. And now is when I'm standing up to do something. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. The federal government must scrap the current setup and commission a fully resourced blue ribbon panel. And remember, this was written right after 9/11. A blue ribbon panel to conduct a clean and thorough investigation of the fire and collapse, leaving no stones unturned. Firefighters, this is your call to action. Visit World Trade Center investigation, a call to action. Then contact your representatives in Congress and officials in Washington and help us correct this problem immediately. Well, I didn't listen back then, but I founded Firefighters for 9/11 Truth for this reason, to come to the truth here. And what I'm putting out a call to action to firefighters again. I didn't listen then, but I'm hoping more will listen now. We need more firefighters to join our organization. What's going to change this is an overwhelming force of firefighters, because they had the biggest loss of life percentage-wise of any other group. If the FDNY and other firefighters start speaking out about this, this is going to explode, and it's going to open a lot of people's eyes to what really happened. So we'll continue with this now, the destruction of evidence. I just want you to see what happened, what these professionals talk about.
We pressed early on for a full-scale investigation, and of course one of the issues was, while we were doing that, the evidence from the buildings was being destroyed as we were talking about it. And we were advocating early on back then that the process of removing the steel, certainly that wasn't an issue of getting it off the site. But once it was off the site, because this is of course part of a rescue and recovery operation, once it was off the site, there was no real need for speed, basically, to get this steel just, cut up into small pieces and shipped overseas for scrap.
The structural steel that would have been key to figuring out what happened to these buildings, what happened to that? Well, New York City accepted a plan 11 days after the attack to immediately start recycling the steel. Not even in the United States, where some of it might have gotten saved inadvertently. No, it was put on ships bound for India and China to be melted down.
We were concerned about that, and we understood early on that those are going to hold the keys to knowing exactly how the buildings came down. And unfortunately, we were not successful in getting the elected officials and the powers that be to do that. You know, when it was all said and done, we only had a relatively very, very small portion of the steel from those buildings.
There's about 250 pieces of structural steel that we know of saved for analysis, but out of some 200,000 tons. It's hard to imagine how at a crime scene you can destroy evidence so quickly and thoroughly and get away with it.
Actually, after that, there were up to 400 truckloads per day being removed, and all but 236 pieces of steel from that crime scene remain. So, and they never analyzed it. They never tested it for thermite. There is still some steel left that can be tested, so that's what we're calling for. And you have to be the judge. I mean, this is the greatest crime in American history, the first time ever that 3 steel and concrete high-rises collapsed into their own footprint at near free-fall speed. Don't you think we should have tested this and figured it out and saved that steel? I mean, you look at an aircraft crash, they reconstruct the aircraft in a hangar. This was even greater loss of life and engineering disaster that's ever been seen. So you be the judge. Why did they destroy this evidence?
Mayor Bloomberg from New York said, just looking at a piece of steel doesn't generally tell you anything, in his response to these questions.
Myth. The scientific method was used in the investigation.
This is the NFPA, and the manual I've been talking about, I'll continue to talk about tonight. It talks about the scientific method, and that was one of the reasons the investigators who actually I talked to that helped write this said they wanted to set the standard. In the fire service, we have what's called the incident command system, and I'll refer to that again later. And what that is we're trying to nationalize everything so that if we go to a fire in a neighboring state or a neighboring city, we're all working off the same page. And so that's what the scientific method, that's why they applied this to the fire service and investigations. So first thing is you recognize the need. Next is define the problem, then collect the data, analyze the data, develop a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, and then select the final hypothesis. So there's also in this manual, there's federal evidence rules, and this is pretty clear. Types of evidence, there are basically 3 types of evidence, all of which in some manner relate to fire investigators. They're demonstrative evidence, documentary evidence, and testimonial. So those are the kind of things that arson investigators and even firefighters. And just to preface my experience, I have been a firefighter. I'm not an arson investigator, but we're trained in the basics of arson investigation because we're the first ones on the scene, and we're the ones who are actually, just like the Pentagon should have been protected, we protect a scene after the fire until the investigators get there. We don't allow homeowners into the house. We don't allow anybody to go snooping through there, and we try to do as little disturbing once we get the fire out. Once we get the fire and the victims out, we stop touching it until the investigators have a chance to look at it. Generally, the cause of a fire explosion is not known until near the end. As a result, the entire fire scene should be considered physical evidence and should be protected and preserved. Makes sense. We should be protecting these scenes, and we're going to show later what happened.
Myth. There were only 2 towers destroyed on 9/11.
Let's see if that's true. This was the 3rd skyscraper to collapse on 9/11. It was about a football field in length away from what was at one time the highest buildings in the world when they were built for about a year. It may be dwarfed next to those, but it would be like the highest building in most of our states. Now, this building wasn't hit by an airplane, so its manner of destruction is really quite interesting for us researching this. It collapses at about 5:20 in the afternoon of 9/11. You can see here the North Tower has come down. Building 7 is still standing. The North Tower is already down here, and the building is still standing. Fires started about 1 o'clock in the afternoon and burned 3 or 4 hours. Let's take our first look at the collapse of this building, narrated by Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Dan never repeats these words again after 9/11. He's using his intuition to describe what he's seeing, which is what we should all be doing. In fact, most of us have never seen this building on mainstream television, even though it was the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. Let's take one more look. Smooth, symmetrical. The penthouse falls a second earlier, indicating core column damage. Let's bring it back up. A classic kink in the middle. We want to keep that building from damaging any other buildings. Well, I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's put a known controlled demolition on the right and building 7 on the left. Is there any similarities? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Since every other high-rise that has ever come down in history has been brought down with explosives, and fire has never brought one down in history at all.
In the fire service, I talked about the incident command system. There's people in here that talk about foreknowledge, talk about it's coming down. We are not saying that these people were involved in any way, because in an incident command system or a fire scene, you get orders from above. There could be just a rumor planted somewhere, and it can trickle down. Just because we're reporting something or firefighters are, doesn't mean they're in on it.
Let's see what they know. Listen for the explosion at the beginning of this video. The mysterious construction worker turning his head around and saying, "Did you hear that? Keep your eye on that building. It's coming down."
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Move it back.
All right, guys? Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Lots of confusion out on the street about this building and what it's about to do. How do they know it's about to blow up? There's a few scattered fires in there. Kevin McPadden and others were moved back 6 blocks behind Building 7. He's a first responder, an Air Force medic. Let's listen to what he hears from the radio held by the Red Cross worker.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here?
Myth. The government looked for evidence of explosives.
One of the things I looked at when I first looked into this was, what do the officials say about it? What are the reports? And so I went to the questions and answers about the World Trade Center 7 collapse from NIST. I spoke about this in San Francisco at Richard's press conference, and these questions were up. They've been up for over 2 years. After our press conference, when we talked about what we're going to talk about here, you can no longer go to this page. So I've saved the screenshot so we can still see them. But this is NIST's final report. Is it possible that thermite or thermate contributed to the collapse of World Trade Center 7? And we'll get in later to what that is. NIST has looked at the application and use of thermite to determine its use to sever columns on 9/11 was unlikely. It is unlikely that 100 pounds of thermite or more could have been carried into World Trade Center 7 and placed around columns without being detected. So they're basically saying because it's hard to do, it's unlikely, because it would be difficult, we shouldn't test for it. They also say, did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse of World Trade Center 7? No, and this is their answer. No blast sounds were heard on the audio tracks of video recordings during the collapse of World Trade Center 7 or reported by witnesses. They said there was no audible sound, no witnesses, no recordings, and you're going to see contrary to that tonight. But what they didn't do is they didn't read Chapter 18, the basic manual that talks about explosions. In that manual, it says very clearly, Chapter 18, although an explosion is almost always accompanied by the production of a loud noise, the noise itself is not an essential element in the definition of an explosion. So you don't need to have a loud noise to consider explosives. You can have it without any noise. 18.13.2.1, identify explosion or fire. First, determine whether the incident was a fire, explosion, or both, and which came first. The evidence of an explosion is not obvious. The investigator should look for signs of an overpressure condition existing within the structure, including displacement or bulging of walls, floors, ceilings, doors and windows, roofs, other structural members. So we saw all that happen. Those buildings came apart. We obviously had all those things happen. So next, you have to identify the force vectors. So the greater the force, the farther similar pieces of debris will be thrown from the epicenter. So in Trade Centers 1 and 2, you'll see later, they were thrown great distances. We were seeing all the signs. Explosion pressures. 10 psi overpressure, you'll have probable total destruction of the building. At 30, steel towers will be blown down. Well, we obviously saw that in all 3 buildings. So only that kind of overpressure would cause that. The fact that we have that happen, we should suspect explosives also. High order damage is characterized by shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris. We had that. So this is, obviously, we see shattering of the structure, small pulverized debris. 19.4.8.2.6, extremism. Terrorists may include fire as but one of a variety of weapons along with explosives used in furthering his or her goal. Well, we know they used them in 1993 on the World Trade Center. We know Oklahoma City was brought down by explosives. So if we have all this history of it, we have the manual saying you should test over and over. What are the excuses? Why did they refuse to this day to test for it?
Myth. There were no witnesses of explosions.
Is that true? Let's listen to Barry Jennings.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
He was the emergency coordinator for the New York Office of Emergency Management. So they said there were no witnesses. That's their excuse for not testing. Well, here we have one, and we're going to see more. This is an NYPD officer.
And the whole time you hear him, thum, 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 thum. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it, you know. I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did. And a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
Now, again, one of the points I want to make from the firefighter standpoint is when you're investigating this, a lot of people say, well, there were pressure tanks, there were diesel fuel tanks, there were boilers, there was all types of things in there that they say could have accounted for those explosions. You have to back up. We're doing an investigation. You don't have to prove it before you decide to investigate whether it happened or not. When you have this kind of witnesses, remember one of the 3 types of evidence we talked about was witness testimony. So we have testimonial evidence of explosives. So this is a very solid reason why to test. And again, here's Kevin McPadden again.
What did he hear after the radio transmission from the Red Cross worker?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 boom. Like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom! And like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And now this goes beyond witness testimony. They said there were no recordings.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Now again, they say there's no explosions. You be the judge.
Myth. The firefighters did not report explosions.
9/11 Commission had some of the firefighters come in. The firefighters said they told them about the explosions. However, none of that made it into the 9/11 Commission report. So there's absolutely no witness reports of any explosions. There's more than 118 of them who heard them. Originally, they weren't going to document this, but the City Fire Commissioner, Tom Von Essen, he wanted to preserve these accounts. And in the fire service, when we go to fires, there's a lot of times where there's just chaos, and we see one small part of that picture. And afterwards, we'll have what's called a post-fire, and we'll talk about it. And we'll see videos and pictures and stuff, and like, oh yeah, that's what that noise was, that's what this was. So we come to a collective memory, and we work together at the fire, but we come up with a memory that is almost like one, because we're told all these different things, and we realize that we didn't see it, so we put it together that way. Well, this commissioner knew that. As he quoted, to preserve the accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory. So they didn't release these. It happened in 2001. They were collected from October to January, and it wasn't until the New York Times filed a Freedom of Information Act to get these, and so they finally got them published. So we didn't have them until August of 2005, so we just have come across these. I'd like to introduce 2 of my good friends. Lila Selk is a retired Palo Alto firefighter, and Jason Abney is a firefighter I came in with to Seattle. And Jason helped me start Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, and Lila has signed on since, and she has been a huge help. Both of them have contributed their time, their money. They both volunteered to come here. And I just want to acknowledge them for what they've done. And what they're going to be doing tonight is just reading just a few of the first responder reports from the oral histories and also from Women at Ground Zero.
Lila Selk and Jason Abney.
Sorry.
A couple minutes later, it sounded like bombs going off. That's when the explosions happened. I could hear it coming, and I knew something was going to happen. I braced myself. It started to get dark. Then all of a sudden, there was this massive explosion. We were on the mezzanine of Building 1, which is all encased in glass. The windows blew in, everything went black, and we all got thrown. I had burn marks, not like you'd have from a fire, but my face was all red. My chest was red. And for 3 or 4 days, there was stuff coming out of my body like you wouldn't believe. It was like shrapnel. It's still coming out. I'll look over and have this little pinpoint under my skin, and it will be bleeding. I was coughing up black stuff, and there was black stuff coming out of my ears and my nose. That was Sue Keene, Port Authority police officer.
Richard Benasiski, FDNY. We were there, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then I just remember there was just an explosion. It seemed like on television they blow up these buildings. It seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions.
There were a lot of explosions through the elevator shafts, and people were blown right out of their clothes. I found their clothes, and they were just shredded. I found their sneakers. There were shoes everywhere. I walked through these piles, through all this gray dirt, and it's like I'm walking through them, the people. I know it's all that's left of them. That was Detective Jennifer Abramowitz, NYPD.
Edward Kachia, FDNY. As my officer and I were looking at the South Tower, it just gave. It actually gave at a lower floor, not the floor where the plane hit, because we originally had thought there was like an internal detonation of explosives because it went in succession. Boom, 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 boom. And then the tower came down.
With that explosion, more people came running out of the building. 2 cops were yelling at me, "Get up, run, get up, run!" I wasn't even thinking I was hurt. I wasn't feeling anything. I was able to get up and run and got into a little doorway with them. One of them was Nancy Ramos, a rookie cop with the Manhattan Traffic Task Force. We stayed there until the explosions stopped, until it was almost silent again. Then we all ran back and continued evacuating people from the building. It seemed like we were there for hours. My adrenaline was just going and going. About 20 minutes later, we heard a huge plane coming in. We couldn't see anything because we were under the overhang, but we heard this plane and the echo of it. Then it hit the building. That was Carol Pochner, NYPD.
Joseph Mayola, FDNY. As we were looking up at the building, what I saw was it looked like the building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building.
And now here are the radio transmissions. So these are the rest of the evidence.
Then in the radio transmissions from September 11th, firefighters reported numerous additional explosions going off within the buildings.
I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. 7-8. We just had another explosion. Warren Street because of the secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion. And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013 down. Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area. Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 2?
Now, several of those quotes were not during the building collapse. They were talking about they were inside the building reporting those.
Myth. There was no reason to test for explosives.
Now, again, this is from the NIST final report. We already talked about that. It's unlikely there was 100 pounds of thermite could be carried in there. Well, 18.15 in the NFPA 921 says that you should analyze the fuel source. And all available fuel sources should be considered and eliminated until one fuel can be identified as meeting all of the physical damage criteria. So if you have pulverized concrete, you need to consider fuels other than gas. Exotic accelerants, 19.2.4. Exotic accelerants. Thermite mixtures produce exceedingly hot fires. Such accelerants generally leave residues that may be visually or chemically identifiable. So indicators of exotic accelerants include an exceedingly rapid rate of fire growth, which would be expected from a jet-fueled fireball. Brilliant flares, again expected, but the one thing that's not expected is melted steel or concrete, and we're going to show you some of that. And melted steel or concrete, I've never seen it, I've never even heard of it at a fire scene.
Myth. Jet fuel and office fires explain the evidence found at ground zero.
Do they? Jet fuel and office fires burn about 14, 16, maybe 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. But listen to this. Who's heard saying this? As if 21 days after the attack, the fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. None other than Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer responsible for the design of the World Trade Center, and his associate, Richard Garlock, who is quoted as saying, "Debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running." The problem here is that these temperatures are twice the temperatures that normal office fires or jet fuel can even get to. Fires burned and molten metal flowed, says this urban search and rescue worker. Saw pools of literally molten steel, says the president of the cleanup company, Tully Construction. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. And this molten metal pouring out of the South Tower minutes before its collapse. NIST tells us that this is molten aluminum from the jet plane. But we know that molten aluminum in daylight conditions looks silvery, not bright orange and yellow. Molten steel beams to human remains. I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center, says this structural engineer from UC Berkeley. He documents the melting of girders. Office fires and jet fuel don't do this. Nor do they do this. From the 2 or 3 pieces of steel that were saved from World Trade Center 7 and the Twin Towers, they're documented as having intergranular melting, rapid oxidation, sulfidation, sulfur forming on this hot corrosion attack on the steel, turning solid steel girders into Swiss cheese. And what happens after they pull this molten metal up from deep beneath the pile?
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Well, what is the problem here? We have the hottest office fires that are said to be in the Twin Towers, about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. NIST claims actually 1,800 degrees. Actually, there's no evidence for fires over 400, 500, 600 degrees. Structural steel doesn't even melt till twice that temperature, 2,700 degrees. What could be capable of creating those temperatures? We'll be looking at a likely suspect called thermite, an incendiary that creates molten iron at over 4,500 degrees. Before we get there, though, let's listen to John Gross, lead investigator for the official story from NIST, and what is his perspective on all of this molten metal?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel.
I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Volcano. No eyewitness who said so.
There actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks at least.
Nobody who's produced it.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
Nobody who's produced it. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
What's going on here? Somebody is lying. Well, I leave it up to you to make your official determination, but if we're it, those proponents of the official story, why would they be doing this? Because they can't possibly account for the temperatures, the extremely hot temperatures associated with this phenomenon.
Well, I was just going to say, it looks like they haven't done their basic investigation. It doesn't look like they're leaving the office to find these witnesses, because several thousand people have found them without any issues here.
Myth. Thermite doesn't cut steel.
Well, what is thermite anyway? Could it be responsible for all of this molten metal?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Shyam Sunder says, well, you'd need 100 pounds of thermite in the frequently asked questions. Well, we'll find out if that's true or not. This particular invention allows thermite to be packed into a cutter charge. This is patented in 1999, ejecting molten iron, the byproduct of thermite, through the structural steel in just milliseconds. But is there any evidence of thermite in the World Trade Center dust? This dust is actually pulverized concrete, 100-micron particles, most of them, scattered throughout lower Manhattan, laid like a blanket, 4 to 12 inches thick. What do official sources find in all of this dust? Billions and billions and billions of small, previously molten iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair. They're so characteristic that they say it's not World Trade Center dust unless it has these small iron microspheres. They do analysis on it. They find that they are predominantly molten iron. Where did the molten iron come from? It doesn't have the alloys of structural steel, so it's not melted steel. Where could it have come from? Let's take a look and see in this thermite experiment where they might have come from.
Into a sphere roughly due to surface tension, and they'll solidify in the air, and so all that information is preserved in the dust. And we then look at the dust and are learning a great deal about what happened.
Fascinating. Dr. Stephen Jones does his own analysis on these microspheres from the World Trade Center dust, and he takes one of his 4 samples that have been sent to him with his magnet, and he finds that not only do we have these previously molten iron spheres, but there's pulverized metal, like metal filings in there as well. Well, we know they're missing tens of thousands of file cabinets. We know we're missing metal decking. So what does he find in their chemical makeup? He finds that it's basically the same result as if you burn thermite in a controlled experiment, iron, aluminum, etc. Dr. Jones concludes, therefore, that this is significant evidence of aluminothermic reactions, whose original constituents in the unignited thermite must have been something like aluminum powders, iron oxide powder, copper oxide, zinc nitrate, potassium permanganate. So he goes back to the dust. Once again, maybe he missed something a year later. What comes up to his magnet again? These small chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They're about 1/16 of an inch long, the largest ones. They're in every sampling, hundreds of them in each sampling. Why do they come up to the magnet? Because of the iron content. He does an analysis on them. Sure enough, confirms that it's very similar to thermite. So he takes a chip, slices it open, zooms in 50,000 times. What does he see? Extremely small particles of iron oxide powder and aluminum, 1,000 times smaller than the human hair. These are at the nano scale. They have no business being that small. They're highly engineered components, perfectly uniform. And 40 nanometer crystalline rhomboidal shaped iron oxide particles and wafers of aluminum powder, 40 nanometers by 400 nanometers. These are in the perfect proportion to each other to make up thermite, and they're set in an organic bed of carbon. This provides the gas that makes for the explosive work. Extremely small particles have an incredible surface area, so the chemical reaction occurs almost instantaneously. He puts it in a heater, basically, a differential scanning calorimeter, and they blow up at 420 degrees centigrade, just like the literature that's been produced on this substance. He compares the spheres that are produced from that ignition, and they match the chemicals of the spheres found in the World Trade Center dust. Fascinating. This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It is made only in the most sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories. All of this work is documented very carefully in a 25-page peer-reviewed scientific paper from the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It is moving through scientific circles with quite a bit of controversy. Dr. Jones then concludes that these experiments through EDS, XRF, etc., identifying these various components, find that it's extremely compelling evidence that thermitic compounds were deliberately placed in both the World Trade Center, Twin Towers, and Building 7.
The physical evidence that you've seen, the science, and the real-time accounts make it apparent that our government lied to us about the building collapses. The 9/11 Commission reinforced these lies. FEMA and NIST justified them, and the corporate media repeated them and hammered them in. We were fooled. And now we have seen that explosives were used to destroy each of the 3 World Trade Center high-rises on 9/11. But it takes months of advanced planning to engineer and place these explosives. Who had the means, the opportunity, the motive to engage in this crime? Who benefited? These are the classic questions that journalists and crime investigators should be asking. Who had access to these highly secure buildings? Who had access to the extremely sophisticated explosives? AE 9/11 Truth and firefighters for 9/11 Truth do not research these important issues or even speculate. We do not have conspiracy theories. So, unfortunately, this is just the beginning of a disturbing but essential journey for you back into the nightmare of 9/11. The evidence you've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of information that the 9/11 Truth movement has assembled. The questions raised are numerous and ominous, and they must be answered in a new investigation. You will have to discover the evidence that we didn't have time to bring you tonight, and we encourage you to follow up. Thank you.
Like I said, I originally believed the official story. I aggressively defended it. When I first started cracking open that little window that there could be possibly more to this story, I went through every emotion, just like probably a lot of you here who didn't originally believe it or consider it are going through. And I didn't want to believe it. I came up with every excuse not to believe it. Once I started looking more, I saw more and more evidence, then I became angry. Then I wanted to do something. And then I became scared. And I was like, well, if I do something, what's going to happen to me? That's probably a fear a lot of people have. And I know firefighters, that's one of the biggest fears they have of signing that petition or speaking out. There's so many that I know that support what we're doing, but they're not willing to put their name publicly. And I'm asking tonight for any firefighters to sign our petition to show the support. From speaking out and starting this website and meeting Richard and a lot of the other incredible people here tonight, I've also met some military intelligence officers that have taught me a lot. And I asked one of them, how do we win? We can't get through the media. We can't get through most of our friends and family because it's too scary to talk about. How do we do this? And he said, it's easy, Eric. You just shine the light. And he said, just come from a place of love and not fear. Whoever was responsible, no matter who it was, terrorists or whoever had access to all this advanced technology, they operate from fear and darkness. They're not willing to step up here. They're not willing to take credit for what they did. But if we overcome that fear and we talk about how we love each other and we talk about the evidence and the facts and we don't get angry, when you're talking to somebody about this, and this is just one piece of advice if you're speaking to firefighters especially, because it is such an emotional topic for us, once it starts getting that elevated moment where we're arguing, it's done. It's over. Just step back and realize that we are going to win. We're going to keep shining the light. This movement is growing as we stand up together, and those of you in the room, if you can join our causes, and not just ours, start your own. Take action. Do something. Investigate yourself. And just talking about it, that's one of the biggest things, because right now it's so taboo in this country to even talk about it. And this is insane. I mean, my friends, family, it's hard to talk about. My brother, for example, my niece has been one of the biggest helps, and her dad, I've never seen him get this angry when she talked about it. He's now joined, and he is now making bumper stickers and doing everything he can. And so what I'm saying is, if we stand up together, we are going to win. It seems scary. It seems overwhelming. It seems like they're out to get us. But there's so many more of us. And if we come from a place of love, they're not going to be able to stop us.
You have the tools now to follow up. It's extremely important that you do. So we're asking all of you to demand a new investigation. Call and write your congressman, television stations, letters to the editor. However you have to do it, there's action that each of you are called to do. Sign our petitions, the AE 9/11 Truth petition and Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, demanding a real investigation. You can sign our petition here and on the Firefighters website as well. We ask you to become a sustaining member as well for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and for Firefighters for 9/11 Truth. Most of all, we're asking you to speak the truth about 9/11, for a time comes when your silence is in fact betrayal. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Even if you are afraid to do things, the big thing, like I said, is just talking to people, talking with your family, talking with your friends. Make this a normal thing to talk about so that this will spread like wildfire. It's starting now. And for firefighters, sign the petition. Start showing the other firefighters that you have the courage to stand up. It's really hard in the fire service because we depend on each other for our lives, obviously. And we have to operate as one at a fire. We have to think about what we're doing as one, because if we're all going off in different directions, it's not going to get done. But as a result of that, we're scared to go out of that norm. We're scared to talk about things that are going to upset the other guys. And that's what happens in New York a lot. Be that one guy or the one girl that stands up. Soon you're going to start seeing this spreading. It's starting to happen. But sign our petition. And a lot of people say that petition doesn't mean anything. It's not going to get anywhere. To be honest, I agree. It's not going to go through the proper channels to get what we want, but what it does do is it shows the rest of the people that come to our website publicly how many people are supporting us. And when it's humans are sheep, basically, and when we start seeing more people looking into this and signing this, we're going to want to join too. We're laying that foundation. Right now, in the fire service, you're the trailblazers. If you sign that and start talking about this, you're going to make a huge difference in this world.
The need right now in America is for patriots to step forward and speak an unpopular truth that will, in fact, save your country.